porch boards have silvered with 40 years of sun, and the woman sitting on them has silvered a good deal more than that. She holds a brass compass in her lap, the kind a surveyor might carry, its case worn smooth where a thumb has rubbed it thousands of times without thinking. Behind her, catching the last orange light of evening, stand the stone ruins, mended now, mortared, roofed in places where once there had only been rubble and silence, and the wind moving through gaps like something looking for a way out. She does not look at them. She does not need to. She has looked at them every evening, for longer than most people live. She waits until the visitor has settled into the second chair, the one she keeps out here for exactly this purpose, before she speaks. Before she tells it properly, she says, she would like to know where the listener is sitting tonight. What town, what porch, what kitchen table, what season pressing against the window glass. It is a small courtesy, she says, the kind her father always insisted on before beginning any survey. You note the conditions first, the light, the ground, the weather, so that later, when you read the record back, you understand what the world looked like when the measuring was done. She is an old woman now, and she can afford such courtesies. She was not always able to. There was a year, she says, turning the compass once in her palm without opening it, when she was 21 years old and possessed exactly $3.11, counted out to her, in coin, across a bank counter by a man who did not raise his voice or his eyes to do it. She possessed, besides that sum, a canvas satchel, 2 changes of clothing, a father's compass, and a legal claim to a pile of stones in the basin that no surveyor's map before or since had ever troubled to name. The bank did not want the stones. The territory did not want the stones. Nobody wanted the stones, she says, and there is something in her voice now that is not quite a smile, a dry amusement, sanded down by decades, the kind that only comes from having been right about something for a very long time. She looks toward the ruins at last, the way a person looks at an old friend who has heard all the same stories and does not mind hearing them again. It began, she says, long before that morning at the bank counter, long before the coins were counted and the paper signed and the door held open for her with perfect, unhurried politeness. It began with a smaller, quieter place, a house with a porch not unlike this one, a father who carried a compass just like the one now resting in her lap, and who believed, with the plain conviction of a man who had spent his life reading land no one else troubled to read, that the ground remembers what people forget. Settle in, she says. She will tell it from there. The town, she says, sat in a fold of land, where the wind had nothing to slow it down, and so it came through every season the same, dry in summer, dry in winter, carrying grit that worked itself into the seams of shirts and the pages of books and the hinges of doors, until everything in that town, given enough years, learned to creak the same complaint. There was a mercantile, a stable, a church with a bell that had cracked some time before anyone could remember and rung ever after with a flat, apologetic note. And there was the survey office, a low building of unpainted lumber where her father kept his instruments and his ledgers, and, behind it, in a house no larger than 4 rooms, set end to end, he kept her. Her mother she never knew. A fever the same year she was born, she says, without elaboration, the way a person speaks of weather that occurred before they were old enough to feel it, a fact reported rather than mourned, though the reporting itself, if one listened closely, carried its own kind of weight. There was a photograph once, she says, in a tin frame, of a woman standing very straight in a dark dress, and for years she believed the stiffness in the woman's shoulders was simply how people held themselves in photographs, until she was older and understood it might have been something else. Grief, perhaps, or the plain effort of standing still for the length of an exposure while a husband who loved her adjusted the tripod. The house smelled, she remembers, of paper and pipe tobacco and the particular mineral smell of surveying chains left too long in a leather satchel. Her father worked at a table by the window, and she was permitted, from a very young age, to sit beneath it on the floor with a slate and a stub of chalk, drawing lines that meant nothing to her and everything to him, until the day he took the slate from her hands, not unkindly, and began, instead, to teach her what the lines were for. She grew up, she says, motherless but not unloved, in a town that regarded her father with the mild, distracted respect people reserve for a man whose work they do not understand but assume must be necessary, since the territory paid for it. She did not have playmates in the ordinary sense. She had the surveying chain, coiled and heavy in its case, and the brass compass that never left her father's coat pocket except when he set it, with great ceremony, into her open palm to show her how the needle found north, regardless of what anyone in town believed north to be. The wind came through every afternoon at the same hour, rattling the office shutters, and she learned, before she learned much else, that some things in this world could be relied upon, and most things could not, and that the difference between them was worth learning to tell apart. Her father's workroom, she says, was the one room in the house that never changed, not through drought, not through the years the roof leaked over the kitchen, not through the long stretch when money was thin enough that meals grew simple and quiet. It sat at the back of the house, facing north for the light, and it smelled always of the same three things: ink, dust, and the particular mineral coolness of brass that has been handled often, but never neglected. There was a table there, scarred along one edge where a hot pan had once been set down without thinking, and across its surface lay the instruments of his trade, in a precision that she came, over years, to understand was not fussiness, but respect. The transit sat under a canvas cover when not in use. The chains were coiled clockwise, always clockwise, and hung on a peg at a height he could reach without looking. The ink bottles were arranged by darkness, the darkest reserved for final ledger entries, the paler for drafts that might still be corrected. He was not a demonstrative man. She does not recall him raising his voice in that room, nor lowering it into tenderness either. His affection, she says, lived in the exactness with which he taught her things, as though precision itself were a form of love he trusted more than words. He would set a benchmark on the table and have her sight along a straight edge until she could tell him, without hesitation, whether it was true. He corrected her plainly when she was wrong, and said nothing at all when she was right, which she learned, in time, to understand as its own kind of praise. He spoke often of the old Spanish land grants, the mission boundary markers cut into stone 100 years before either of them had been born, and he would trace their descriptions aloud, from brittle survey books, as if reciting scripture. So many varas from the dry wash, so many from the standing rock, bearing north by northwest, until the line met water. She did not understand then why he cared so much for boundaries drawn by men long dead. She understood only that when he spoke of them, his voice slowed and steadied, the way another man's might when speaking of scripture or of home. Outside that room, the town went on in its ordinary way. Freight wagons, the assay office, the bank with its brass rail worn smooth by 2 decades of careless hands. But inside it, time moved by a different measure, marked by ink drying and chalk dust settling, and the low scratch of a steel nib across paper. She did not yet know that the habits he was teaching her there, patience with detail, distrust of easy conclusions, the discipline of reading what the land itself was trying to say, were the only inheritance he would leave that no ledger could count or seize, and no uncle could later sign away. She was 8, perhaps 9, old enough to sit still at the kitchen table for an hour if the lamp was trimmed low and the subject interested her, and this subject always did. Her father would clear the oilcloth of supper dishes and unroll the maps he kept wrapped in waxed paper against the damp, weighting the corners with whatever was nearest, a coffee cup, a stone, the pistol he no longer wore but never sold. The maps themselves were not much to look at, brown-edged and spotted, the ink gone the color of weak tea, but he handled them the way other men handled deeds to gold mines, and so she learned to handle them that way too. He taught her the chain first, because he said a person who did not understand the chain could not understand anything that came after. 66 feet, he told her, tapping the table with one finger for emphasis, subdivided into links, and every link a fraction of an acre when you squared it out, and every survey in the territory built on that same patient arithmetic, whether the surveyor knew it or not. She practiced counting links on a length of cord he had knotted for her, eyes closed, until her fingers could tell distance the way another child's might tell the difference between coins by their weight alone. Then came the old grants, the Spanish ones, written not in chains but in varas. A measure shorter than a yard, he explained, and stubborn about it, refusing to convert cleanly into anything the newer maps used, so that a boundary drawn 100 years before never sat quite where later surveyors expected to find it. He showed her how the descriptions ran. So many varas from the dry wash, so many from the standing rock, a bearing north by northwest until the line met water, and how, when he walked those same distances out on paper against the newer government surveys, the lines refused to close. A discrepancy, he called it. Not a lie exactly, but not quite the truth either. And he said the word slowly, the way he said all words he wanted her to remember. She asked him once why the old lines did not match the new ones, and he did not answer right away, which she noticed, because he was not a man who left questions sitting unattended for no reason. He only said that boundaries were promises written down by particular men for particular purposes, and that not every promise was meant to be found by whoever came looking later. Then he went back to the map, and to the chalk, and to the low, steady voice he used for figures, and she understood that she had been given something to carry rather than an answer, a small locked question she would keep turning over long after the lamp was blown out and the maps rolled again in their waxed paper, waiting for the next evening when he would unroll them once more. There were seasons after that when he took her along on the survey trips themselves, not merely to the lamplit table with its rolled paper, and those days she remembered with a clarity that surprised her even in old age, when so much else had gone soft at the edges. He would hitch the wagon before the heat rose, and they would ride out past the last fence line into country that had no fences at all, and somewhere in that country there was always a ruin, a fallen wall, a corner of foundation, a scatter of stone that to anyone else would have looked like nothing more than the leavings of weather. He would stop the wagon without announcement and climb down and stand looking at the stone for a long moment before he said anything, and she learned to wait through that silence the way she had learned to wait through his silences at the table, because she understood by then that his silences were not empty but working. He taught her to tell hand-cut stone from later masonry by running her fingers along the face of it, feeling for the shallow, irregular scars left by a chisel worked by a man without a quarry's proper tools, as against the flatter, more even surface of stone cut by machine or by someone working from a pattern book decades after. He taught her to crouch at a foundation line and press her palm flat against the mortar, because old lime mortar crumbled differently under the thumb than the harder cement mixes that came later with the railroads. And he made her practice this on every ruin they passed, until she could tell the difference without thinking about it, the way she could tell rain coming by the smell of the ground before it fell. He taught her to measure foundation depth with a length of cord and a stone weight, lowering it into whatever gap she could find at the base of a wall, counting the knots he had tied into the cord at even intervals, and to note the depth against the type of structure, because a granary sat shallow, and a cistern sat deep, and a wall, meant only to mark a boundary, sat shallower still. She did not know, in those years, why any of it mattered beyond the pleasure of being taught, the particular pleasure of being the only child for miles who could kneel in the dust beside her father and be trusted with a cord and a stone and a column of figures to keep straight in her head. She only knew that when he said good, low, and without much emphasis, it settled into her the way water settles into dry ground, and that she carried the cord coiled in her pocket for years afterward, long after the trips themselves had stopped, long after the reason for carrying it had changed entirely. The compass came to her on a Tuesday, though she would not have called it that at the time, since the days out there were not named so much as counted, one against the next, by the position of the sun and the state of the water barrel. She was perhaps 11. Her father had been cleaning his instruments on the plank table outside the line shack, the theodolite disassembled into its felt-lined case, the chains coiled, and he had reached into his coat, the same worn canvas coat he wore in every season, and set the compass on the table between them without ceremony, the way a man sets down a tool he intends to use, rather than a thing he intends to admire. It was brass, dulled from handling rather than neglect, the hinge of its lid worn smooth, the needle steady even on the tilted table. He did not say happy birthday, because it was not her birthday. He did not say this is for you, in the tone people use when a thing is meant to be received with any particular feeling. He said, this was my father's, and turned it once in his hand, so the light caught the engraved rows of the directions, worn nearly flat at the north point, from a thumb that was not hers, and had not been his either, not at first. He showed her how the needle would settle if she held it level and still, how it lied if she stood too near an iron tool or a belt buckle, how the glass had a hairline crack across the S that did not affect the reading, but that she should know was there, so she would not mistake it for a fault in the needle itself. He told her, in the same flat register he used for teaching her the cord and the stone, that a compass was only as honest as the man reading it, and that this was true of most instruments and most men. She did not cry, and she did not thank him at length, because that was not how such things passed between them. She said only, I'll keep it dry, which was the correct thing to say, the practical thing, and he nodded once, as if she had answered a question on a survey rather than accepted an inheritance, and went back to cleaning the chains. It was only years later, turning the compass over in a colder season, that she understood the afternoon for what it had been. Not a gift given, but a trust extended, the same trust he had shown her with the cord and the stone, except this time the instrument would outlast the lesson, would outlast him, would sit in her palm decades on, when the man himself was only a smell of dust and pipe tobacco she summoned when she wanted him back. She kept it dry. She kept it, in fact, for the rest of her life, though she did not know that yet, kneeling there in the shack doorway with the brass warm from his coat pocket and the needle finding north without her help. The fever began, as she recalled it, on the second Tuesday of September, in her 19th year, though at the time no one thought to mark the date, and it was only afterward that she went back and counted the days on a calendar tacked to the kitchen wall, the way her father had taught her to count paces between survey markers, because a thing without a number attached to it had a way of sliding out of memory altogether. He complained first of a stiffness in the shoulders, which he blamed on a week spent bent over a chain in the lower basin, and he did not send for the doctor until the following Monday, by which time the stiffness had become a heat she could feel through his shirt when she helped him to his chair. The doctor came 4 times in 11 days. She remembered the number precisely because she was the one who paid him, $2 a visit from the tin box behind the flour sack, and she watched the box empty itself with the same attention she gave to a ledger, without letting the watching become anything so undignified as fear. The doctor spoke of the swamp fever that came some years off the river bottoms, said there was little to be done beyond broth and quinine and cool cloths, and delivered this information in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had said it in other houses before and would say it again in others after. The town, for its part, sent no casseroles, organized no vigil. A neighbor woman asked after him once at the Mercantile, in the tone one used to ask after weather, and did not ask again. This was not cruelty, she came to understand much later. It was simply how a town without much to spare distributed its attention, in small, careful rations, and her father had never been the kind of man who made himself owed anything. He was lucid for most of it, which she would come to think of as the mercy in the whole arrangement, though a thin one. He asked her twice to check the elevation notes in his field book against a set of figures he was certain he'd transposed, and both times the figures were correct, and both times he thanked her as if she had done him a real service rather than humored a sick man. On the 9th day he stopped asking about the notes. On the 11th, a Saturday, cold for September, with a wind that rattled the tin roof in a way she would afterward associate permanently with the sound of waiting, he did not wake past noon, and by the time the doctor arrived for what would be his last visit, there was nothing left for him to do but confirm what she had already measured for herself in the length of the silences between breaths. She sat with the field book closed on her lap and did not open it again for some while. She did not cry then either, not where anyone could see it, and she noted this fact about herself with the same detachment she noted most things, filing it away as data, the way her father had taught her to file everything, weather and distance and grief alike, against the day she might need to make sense of it. The funeral was small, as such things tend to be in a town, where most of the mourners had their own accounts to settle before dark. The minister spoke for 11 minutes, she would recall, though she had not timed it deliberately. Some part of her simply counted, the way her father had counted, out of habit rather than intention. The coffin was pine, unvarnished, built by the same man who built the crates for the mercantile, and she noted that too, filing it beside the other facts: weather clear, wind light out of the west, 22 persons present, including the minister and the man who dug the grave. Her uncle arrived on the Tuesday following, having been sent for by telegram the day her father took his final turn, and she understood even then that his arrival had less to do with grief than with the plain administrative fact that someone was required to close an estate, and he was the only someone available who shared the name. He came off the coach in a gray suit unsuited to the dust, carrying a leather case of the kind used for papers rather than possessions, and he shook her hand rather than embracing her, which she did not resent, exactly, only noted. The handshake brief and dry and businesslike, the handshake of a man greeting a colleague rather than a niece. He stayed in the house 4 days, and in those 4 days he went through her father's effects with the thoroughness of a man auditing a ledger that did not balance to his liking. He found the bank book, he found the modest life insurance policy, paid out promptly and without incident. He found, at the bottom of a trunk, beneath a folded surveyor's coat that still smelled faintly of her father, the field books themselves, dozens of them, spanning better than 15 years of work across 3 counties, and he leafed through these with the flat, uninterested attention of a man checking a stranger's correspondence for anything of value before discarding it. It was in the 3rd of these books that he came upon the notation for the basin, the coordinates, the brief description of the ruins, the phrase, "Foundation, purpose unclear, likely mission era, no economic value." Written in her father's careful hand. Her uncle read this passage twice, she would recall, his mouth set in the particular flatness of a man confirming something he had already suspected, and then he closed the book and set it with the others to be sold or burned, whichever proved less trouble, and said, not unkindly, only as a man states a fact he does not expect to be challenged, that her father had wasted a great many good years measuring land that would never be worth the paper the measurements were written on. She said nothing to this. She had learned, in 11 days of tending a dying man, precisely when silence served better than argument, and she filed this moment away too, beside all the others, waiting, though she could not yet have said for what. The 2 years that followed, she would say afterward, were the kind of years that do not announce themselves as they pass, that leave no single day worth remembering, only a residue, like the fine gray dust that settled on every ledger in her uncle's office, no matter how often the windows were shut against it. She kept his household books. She kept, too, the books of his small holdings in cattle and freight contracts, a task he had given her, not from generosity, but from thrift, having noticed early that she wrote a clean column of figures and rarely erred, and having calculated, in the same flat arithmetic that governed all his decisions, that a niece fed and housed at his table might as well earn her keep at his desk. She was not paid for this. It did not occur to him, she believed, that payment was owed, any more than it occurred to him that a chair or a lamp might expect wages for its service. She rose before the household each morning to have the previous day's entries finished before he came down to breakfast, and she learned, in that stillness before dawn, to move through the rooms of his house the way she had once moved through the basin at her father's side, quietly, watchfully, missing nothing, saying less. She did not complain. This was not, she would explain much later, from any natural sweetness of temperament, but from a colder calculation of her own, learned perhaps from the very man she served, that a woman with no money and no standing, who spoke her grievances aloud, only handed her guardian a reason to be rid of her sooner, and on worse terms. So she held it still. She held it the way one holds a level against a wall to see how far it leans, not with anger, but with the patient attention of someone recording a fact for later use. She noted which of his freight contracts were poorly priced. She noted which ranchers paid him promptly and which he forgave, and why, and she began, without his knowledge, to understand the shape of his fortune as thoroughly as he did, perhaps more thoroughly, since he had long since stopped examining his own ledgers with any care, trusting the numbers to sums that were, in fact, hers. In the evenings, when the house was quiet and his voice no longer required managing, she took down her father's few surviving instruments, the transit he had left her, the brass compass worn smooth at the hinge, the surveyor's chain coiled in its leather sack, and she cleaned them, not because they required it, but because the act of handling them kept some part of her from going entirely still. She did not speak of the basin. She did not speak of the notation in her father's careful hand. She only waited, the way she had learned to wait at a sickbed, for the moment when waiting would no longer be the wisest course. The old woman remembered the date the way she remembered few others, not because the date itself carried weight, but because her uncle had chosen it with the same deliberateness he brought to every transaction, waiting until the quarterly accounts were settled and the bank's books stood clean before he called her in. It was a Tuesday, the 3rd of the month, and the morning had come in cold and clear, the kind of high desert cold that sits in the shoulders and does not lift until well past 9. She remembered the smell of the bank, ink, and the oiled wood of the counters, and beneath it, the faint metallic smell of the strongbox when it was opened, and she remembered that her uncle did not ask her to sit. He had the ledger already open when she came in, the page marked with a strip of paper, and he turned it toward her without preamble, as though the courtesy of explanation were an expense he had already decided not to bear. He read the figures aloud in the flat register he used for reading figures aloud to anyone, the balance her father had left, the freight debt still owed against it, the fee for administering an estate with no surviving spouse, the fee for the transfer of the account itself. He did not look up while he spoke. When he reached the bottom of the column, he turned the ledger back around, squared it against the edge of the counter, and counted the remainder onto the wood in coin and small bills, slowly, the way a man counts change he intends no one to dispute. $4.11. He did not say that this was all there was. He did not need to. The ledger said it for him, and he had long since learned to let ledgers speak in his place. He slid the coins toward her with 2 fingers, and closed the account book with the flat sound of a door that has been shut many times before and fits its frame exactly. He said only that the estate was now settled, that there were no further claims outstanding, and that she should consider the matter closed. He did not ask what she intended to do. He did not ask where she would go. He had already, she understood, stopped thinking of the question as one that concerned him. She gathered the coins without hurrying, folded them into the small cloth purse she had sewn herself the winter before, and thanked him. She remembered thanking him, though she could never afterward say why, except that it was the shape her mother had taught her for leaving a room with dignity intact. He had already turned back to the next ledger on his desk before she reached the door. The bell above it rang once, thin and small against the morning, and outside the light was already hard and white on the packed street, and she stood for a moment on the step with $4.11 in her hand, calculating, in the same quiet way she had once calculated freight contracts that were not hers, exactly how far such a sum could carry a person who had nowhere left to be carried to. She was 3 steps from the door when he spoke again, and she would think, all the years after, that it was not kindness that made him speak, but tidiness, the same instinct that made him square his papers before locking the drawer at night. There was, he said, one more matter, a parcel. Desert acreage, south of the Basin Road, recorded under her father's name in the county rolls, assessed at a value so low the bank had never troubled itself to include it among the estate's listed properties. Stone ruins on it, he believed, some old foundation work, walls without a roof, the sort of ground no rancher wanted, because it held no water and no grass worth grazing. He said this the way he might describe a chipped teacup left in an inventory, an item to be disposed of rather than appraised. He was prepared, he told her, to sign the deed over to her directly, and to save the bank the trouble of carrying a worthless parcel on its books any longer. He named a price, $1. She stood very still by the door, the bell above it not yet done trembling from her first attempt to leave. and she found that she was studying his face the way her father had taught her to study a boundary stone, for what it was actually saying beneath what it appeared to say. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ledger open on his desk, at the neat column where the parcel's transfer would be entered, at the clean line it would make once the property left his columns and became someone else's problem. He wanted the account closed entirely. He wanted no loose page anywhere bearing her father's name. She did not ask why land assessed at nothing was being sold, rather than simply abandoned, though the question moved through her, quiet and precise, the way her father's questions used to move through survey chains before he spoke them aloud. She only opened the purse again and counted out $1 from the 4, and watched him draw the paper toward himself and begin, without ceremony, to write. The deed itself was a plain thing, a single sheet, his signature and hers, a county seal pressed into wax that had gone slightly soft in the morning heat. He did not read the boundary description aloud to her, and she did not ask him to. She had read enough of her father's survey notations as a girl to know she could find the courses and distances herself, later, in daylight, with the paper spread flat on her knee. He blotted the ink, folded the sheet twice, and handed it across the counter with the same detached courtesy he had shown the coins. She left with $3.11 in her purse, and a single folded page that named her, for the first time in her life, the owner of something no one else believed was worth owning. She did not think of it again until years later, turning the whole scene over in memory, the way one turns a coin to catch the light differently, and only then did she understand what she had seen, and failed, at the time, to name. In the instant before he slid the deed across the counter, his hand had stopped, not for long, a breath, perhaps two, but stopped all the same, his fingers resting flat against the paper as though some current had passed up through the wood of the desk and arrested him mid-motion. His eyes had gone, briefly, to a middle distance somewhere past her shoulder, the particular stillness of a man, looking not at what was before him, but at what was long behind him. She had thought at the time it was simply the pause of a careful clerk checking his own work. She came to believe, later, it was her father's face he had seen there, or perhaps their mother's, or the specific hour of some boyhood she knew nothing about, since he had never once, in all the years she could remember, spoken of what he and her father had been to each other, before the ledgers and the bank and the long-practiced distance had come between them. Whatever it was, it passed. His hand resumed its motion, unhurried, and the deed crossed the counter, and he was again the man of coins counted to the cent, and papers signed without ceremony. She folded the deed once more, though it was already folded, and placed it inside her coat against her ribs, where she could feel its edge through the cloth as she walked. The bank door swung shut behind her with the same dry, ordinary sound it had made 100 times before, in 100 other transactions that had nothing to do with her, and she stood for a moment on the boardwalk in the full weight of the morning sun, blinking against the brightness after the dim interior, the street already loud with wagon wheels and the flat calling voices of men, unloading crates before the heat grew worse. No one on that street knew what had just been decided behind the bank's narrow window, nor would have cared if they had known. She had $3.11, a folded deed to ground no one wanted, and a satchel that held, besides a spare dress and a tin cup, the one object her father had pressed into her hand before the fever finished its work, and she began, without hurry, to walk toward the edge of town, toward the road that led out past the last fence line, and into the flat, pale distance where the basin waited, indifferent, exactly as it had waited for 140 years before her. I remember the weight of that satchel more clearly than I remember my own face at 21, she would say, decades later, from the porch, that now looked out over the basin as though the basin had always belonged to her. The canvas had been her father's, oiled dark at the corners from years of his hands, and into it she had packed, the night before, everything that seemed to matter, and nothing that did not. The compass went in first, wrapped in a handkerchief though it needed no protection, set into the corner where it would not shift. Then the notebooks, 4 of them, their pages filled with his careful surveyor's hand, bearings, distances, the small diagrams he made of boundary stones and arroyo cuts, notes on soil and rock that meant nothing to anyone who had not been taught to read them. Then the brass instruments themselves, wrapped in cloth against each other so they would not rattle, the transit's eyepiece, the chain links coiled and tied, the plumb bob that had hung so many times from his steady hand, while she held the far end of a tape in some sunburned field, waiting for his signal. She left before first light, while the town was still only a scattering of dark shapes, and a single lamp burning in the stable, where a groom was already awake with the horses. No one saw her go, and she did not look back to see if anyone watched from a window. The road out of town was familiar for the first mile, then unfamiliar, then nothing but road. 2 ruts worn into hardpan by wagons that had long since stopped coming this way, bordered by creosote and the pale skeletons of Ocotillo, the sky above it colorless with the coming heat. The distance to the basin was 2 days on foot, and she had known this before she left, had traced it herself on one of her father's old maps, the night before by lamplight, measuring the miles with her thumb and forefinger, the way he had taught her. The satchel's strap cut into her shoulder by mid-morning, and by noon she had learned to shift it, to let the weight ride against her hip instead, the way he had shown her once on a survey trip when she was 14, and complaining, though she did not remember complaining now, only the lesson. She walked when the light allowed it and rested when it did not, and the country around her did not change so much as reveal itself slowly, mile by mile, growing flatter, growing quieter, the fence lines falling away behind her, until there were no fences at all, only the road, and the sky, and the distance ahead, where the ground itself seemed to be waiting for something it had waited a very long time to receive. She has told this part of it fewer times than any other, and even now, recalling it from the porch of a house that did not exist then, she finds herself reaching for the plainness of it, rather than the feeling, because the feeling was mostly just heat, and thirst managed carefully, and a kind of attention she had not known she possessed until the desert required it of her. By the second afternoon, the road had thinned to something barely a road at all, 2 ruts pressed into caliche that had not seen a wagon in years, and she left it where her father's map told her to leave it, striking out cross-country toward a line of low hills that would not resolve into anything distinct until she was nearly upon them. The heat by then was not a temperature, but a presence, something that stood alongside her, and she rationed the water in the canteen the way he had taught her, not by the clock, but by the shadow, drinking when the shadow of her own body shortened past a certain point, and not before, no matter how her mouth dried. He had told her once, crouched beside her over a survey line north of the river, that a man who drank by thirst alone had already made his first mistake, and she had not understood him then, being perhaps 12, and understood him perfectly now, alone, with no one to correct her if she got it wrong. She read the ground as he had shown her too, not searching for water so much as reading where water had been, the pale stain of old runoff along a wash, the particular gray-green of vegetation that meant root systems reaching something below the surface, and though she found none of it worth trusting enough to draw on, the reading itself steadied her, gave the walking a shape beyond simple endurance. When the light failed, she made her camp low, in the lee of a shelf of rock still warm from the day, and did not build a fire large enough to be seen from any distance, only enough to warm the tin plate she ate from, a habit she could not have explained except that he had always done it so, and some things a person keeps not from reason but from inheritance. The stars came out complete and merciless, more of them than she remembered from any night in town, and she lay with the satchel under her head, and the compass warm against her collarbone, where she had taken to wearing it on its cord, and she did not sleep so much as rest with her eyes closed, listening to the country settle around her, the small tickings and shiftings of a desert cooling after a day of punishment. She woke before first light from habit alone, the sky, still holding its last stars, the cold surprising her the way it always did in that country, and she ate a little of the bread from the paper sack and drank sparingly, and rose to walk again while the ground was still merciful, the basin somewhere ahead of her, still hidden behind the hills, patient, unhurried, as if it had been waiting the entire time for her to arrive on its own schedule, and not hers. She came upon the basin the way her father had always said, a person comes upon anything that matters, sideways, and without ceremony, so that she nearly missed it entirely, distracted as she was by a jackrabbit breaking cover to her left. The land simply opened. One moment she was climbing a shallow rise thick with creosote, and the next, the ground fell away before her into a wide, shallow bowl the color of old bone, rimmed on its far side by a low outcropping of red rock going purple in the last of the light. And there, perhaps a half-mile distant, sat the ruins. She stopped walking. She would say later, from the distance of many decades, that she stood there longer than she needed to, though at the time, it had not felt like standing so much as being held. From where she stood, they looked exactly like what her uncle had called them across his desk, with the particular flatness of a man reading a number aloud. A jumble of collapsed stone, nothing more. She could see, even at that distance and in that failing light, the long, low mounds of tumbled wall, softened by decades of wind, until they resembled something closer to geology than architecture, a scattering of gray shapes that any rider passing at a trot would take for a homestead some family had started and abandoned, defeated by the country the way so many had been defeated by it, their ambition reduced now to rubble and to the kind of silence that settles over failure once enough years have passed over it. That was what the basin offered to anyone who did not know how to look, a dead man's foolishness, a cautionary shape on the land, the sort ranchers rode past without slowing, the sort that gave a place its bad name, and its low price, and its $4 dismissal in a ledger book 200 miles east. She did not go down to it that evening. The light was going, and she had learned, from a man who had learned it the hard way himself, that a person does not walk unfamiliar ground in the dark, no matter how close the prize sits, and so she made her camp on the rise instead, at a distance that let her keep the ruins in sight while the color drained out of the sky behind them, and she sat with her arms around her knees and studied the shapes the way her father had taught her to study anything, not for what it announced itself to be, but for what it declined to explain. The wall lines did not run the way a settler's cabin ran. She noticed that much even in the dimness, some old attention in her rising unbidden, some instinct passed down through hours bent over survey books at a kitchen table long since sold. The proportions were wrong for a house. The stone was wrong for a house. She said nothing to the empty basin. She only watched it a while longer, until the first stars came out over the rimrock, and then she lay down to sleep, with the ruins fixed in her mind, exactly as they were, not yet understood, only noticed, and let the noticing wait, patient as her father had always told her the land itself was patient, for morning. She woke before the color came back into the sky, the way she had woken every morning of her working life, and she did not linger over the waking. There was a discipline to it her father had drilled into her, without ever naming it as discipline. You rose when the light allowed you to see your own hand, and you began, because the desert did not care what hour a person felt ready. She paced the perimeter first, counting under her breath the way he had taught her, each stride measured to be as even as she could make it, heel to toe, the old habit of turning her body into an instrument. She had no surveyor's chain, only a length of cotton rope she had knotted the night before at measured intervals, and she stretched it along the base of the longest wall and noted the figures in the small book she carried, the same economical hand her father had used, numbers small and square and without ornament. The wall ran 41 feet along its face before it dropped away at a corner too precise to be accidental. She had seen collapsed homestead walls before, seen the way frost and neglect pulled a structure crooked over the years, seen the sag and lean of stone set by men in a hurry. This was not that. The corner held a true angle, and when she sighted along it with her thumb and eye, squinting the way he had shown her over a fence line one autumn when she was no older than 12, she found no drift in it at all. She knelt at the base and ran her palm over the stone itself, and here again, something declined to match the story the ranchers told in town, the tired tale of some failed dreamer who had raised 4 walls and starved before finishing a roof. The blocks were dressed, not merely stacked. Someone had squared their faces with a chisel, had fitted them with a patience no man building in fear of winter would have spent. She had seen this cutting before, though it took her a moment standing there in the widening light to place where, in the old mission ruins her father had once walked her through as a girl, tracing his finger along the tool marks, and telling her that the hand of a mason could be read the way a signature could, if a person only knew to look. She sat back on her heels and looked at the basin around her, empty and indifferent, giving away nothing more than it had the night before. She thought of the rancher's flat dismissal, the boy's careless waving hand toward worthless rock. She thought of her father's books, the boundary markers he had made her memorize until she could recite them half asleep. She did not yet have an answer. She had only the beginning of one, small and precise as a single measured line in a ledger, and she wrote it down, and then she rose to walk the second wall. The second wall gave her less than the first, only a longer stretch of the same careful dressing, the same unhurried chisel work running along stone that had no business being unhurried in a country where most men built to survive the season, not to outlast it. She paced its length with her boot heels, counting under her breath the way her father had taught her to count when there was no chain to measure with, and somewhere in that counting, she found herself back in his study on a winter evening, lamp turned low, his voice unhurried in the way it only was when he had forgotten she was still a child, and was simply thinking aloud to someone he trusted to listen. He had spoken, that evening, of a story he did not put much stock in himself, a persistent thing among the older families and the mission records, of silver moved and buried during an uprising 150 years gone, when the garrisons could no longer hold the country, and the priests and their converts had scattered before it could be seized. He had called it the kind of story every territory grew for itself, the way a dry field grows the same stubborn weed no matter how often it is cleared. But he had also said, in that same unhurried voice, that the old boundary markers in this particular basin never sat where later ranch surveys placed them, off by measures too consistent to be careless error, and that inconsistency of that kind was, in his experience, rarely an accident. Men who made mistakes made them differently each time. Men who moved a line on purpose moved it the same way, again and again, until the shift itself became a kind of signature. She had not understood, at 7 or 8, why that mattered. She understood it now, kneeling in the gray dust, with her hands resting flat against dressed stone that no rancher would have paused to notice, and no treasure hunter would have thought worth the sweat of a shovel. If the markers had been moved on purpose, and moved consistently, then someone had wanted this ground remembered a certain way, or else wanted it forgotten a certain way, and either purpose required a hand more patient than legend allowed for. She sat back again, brushing grit from her palms, and let the basin's silence settle around her, the way it had settled around it for a century and more before her arrival meant anything to anyone. The ruin was not, she understood now, the leavings of a failed settlement, abandoned to weather and neglect. It had been built with intention, and intention left traces a careless builder never bothered to leave, traces her father had trained her, patiently and without her ever quite noticing the training, to read. She rose, dusted her skirt, and turned toward the low rise where the third wall, half buried, waited for the sun to climb high enough to show its face. The days that followed did not announce themselves as days. They folded into one another the way basin heat folds into evening, without ever quite cooling, and she measured them, not by sunrise, but by the depth of her trench, and the ache that settled into her shoulders and stayed there. She worked the way her father had shown her to work a survey line, not in bursts of enthusiasm, but in steady, unglamorous increments, each one recorded before the next was begun. A week passed in the clearing of the third wall alone. Another in the tracing of a drainage channel cut into bedrock, so shallow a careless eye would have called it erosion, so precise a patient eye called it design. She kept a ledger of her own now, bound in cloth she had cut from a worn shirt, and into it went every measurement, every angle, every depth, in the same square hand her father had drilled into her over a kitchen table lit by a single lamp. It was in the 4th week, or perhaps the 5th, she no longer trusted her own count exactly, that she found the seam. It ran along the base of the third wall where the stone met what she had taken for undisturbed ground, a hairline break too regular to be a crack, too deliberate to be an accident of settling. She worked it with a trowel and her fingers before she trusted a shovel near it, the way her father had taught her to open old boundary cairns. never breaking what you could not afterward explain. Beneath the seam, the ground gave differently, hollow in a way that made the trowel ring instead of thud, and she sat back on her heels in the white afternoon light and understood, with the calm of someone confirming a suspicion rather than discovering a miracle, that she had found not a wall's foundation but a lid. It took her 3 more days to expose the full outline of it, a cistern chamber, sunk below the visible ruin, its stones fitted with the same drainage logic her father had once diagrammed for her on the back of a survey form, water directed away from a central vault rather than toward it, the opposite of what any careless well-digger would think to do. She traced the channels with her fingers in the fading light, and for the first time since she had arrived in the basin, she allowed herself to believe that what waited beneath the stone had been built to be found only by someone who already knew how to look. The lid itself resisted her for the better part of a morning, not because it was heavy in the way a stone is heavy, but because it had been set with a patience that outlasted whoever had set it there. She found the latch by accident of touch rather than sight, a bronze tongue gone the color of the surrounding earth, recessed into a groove cut so precisely that her father would have measured it twice before believing his own instrument. She worked it with the flat of a chisel, the way she had watched him work a stuck compass housing once, easing rather than forcing, and when it finally gave, it did not creak. It sighed, a long, low exhalation of air that had been sealed inside since before her grandmother's grandmother had been born, and she sat back from it, the way one sits back from a held breath let out too fast. She did not go in at once. She let the opening breathe for a while, the way her father had taught her a shaft or a well must be allowed to clear before a person trusted it with their lungs, and she watched the sun move a hand's width lower toward the western rim of the basin, its light coming in low and orange now, slanting through the gap at an angle that lit the first 3 feet of the interior stone and left the rest in a darkness that seemed, to her, patient rather than threatening. Dust rose in that light, fine as flour, disturbed by the opening of a seal a century old, and it hung there turning slowly, catching gold, before it began at last to settle back down onto the stone floor she could just make out below. She lowered herself in, with the same care she had used opening every cairn before it, one hand on the stone lip, one boot testing the depth before the other followed, and she stood for a moment inside the chamber without moving, letting her eyes adjust, letting the dust finish its long, unhurried descent around her ankles. The air smelled of cold stone and something mineral beneath it, iron perhaps, or old lime mortar, and beneath her feet, the floor felt swept in places, as though hands long since turned to nothing had left it clean on purpose. She raised the lantern. The far wall was not blank. She had expected, she would say later, some kind of gleam, some answer to all the years of ledger lines and dismissed claims, some confirmation that the waiting had been for something. What the lantern showed instead was wood, rotted, gray, collapsed in on itself in long, soft ridges, like something that had once held a shape and had simply given up holding it, decades ago, with no one there to witness the surrender. She stepped closer. The crate, or what had been a crate, lay in 3 pieces against the base of the wall, its iron banding rusted through and folded outward like the petals of some ruined flower, and scattered around it were fittings she recognized only by their outline, a hasp, a strap hinge, the corroded stub of what might once have been a lock, all of it eaten so thoroughly by time that it crumbled faintly at the edge of her boot when she nudged it, without meaning to, without quite believing yet that this was all there was. She stood there longer than she needed to. That, too, she would remember with a kind of distance later, the standing, the not moving, the way disappointment arrived not as a blow, but as a slow settling, the same slow settling as the dust behind her. Somewhere in the walk out from town, in the days of clearing rubble and running string lines true, she had allowed herself to imagine an ending shaped like reward, coin, bar, something with weight and worth that a person could set on a table and call vindication. What she found instead was absence. Whatever the vault had held it once, and someone, long before her uncle had ever signed a ledger closing an account to $4 and a clean conscience, had already come and taken it away, thoroughly, competently, leaving behind only the wood that had carried it and the iron that had bound the wood. She did not sit down. She did not weep. She had learned young, from a man who taught her to read a slope before she trusted her weight to it, that a finding was still a finding, even when it disappointed you, and that the work was not finished merely because the treasure was not there. So she lifted the lantern again, higher this time, and let its light move past the crate, past the scattered fittings, toward the far wall she had noticed and not yet allowed herself to look at directly, the wall that was not blank, that held some marking cut into the stone itself, patient and waiting the way the ruins themselves had waited, for someone who would know how to read it. She set her palm flat against the stone, the way her father had shown her, not to feel for treasure, but to feel for truth, the small, deliberate ridges where one course of mortar ended and another began, the places where a mason's hand had paused, corrected, pressed on. He had taught her this on a church wall in a town whose name she no longer troubled to remember, tracing her fingers along a seam and telling her that a building was a kind of handwriting, that every man who set stone left something of himself in the spacing, in the angle of his trowel, in what he chose to leave rough and what he chose to smooth. She moved along the wall, now the same way, slowly, lantern held low, reading the courses as if they were lines of a letter, written in a language only she among the living still troubled to speak. The marking, when she found it, was not large. It sat at chest height, half hidden by a shadow the lantern had not yet reached, a single incised square no wider than her thumb, and within it, a mark she recognized before she understood why she recognized it. A compass rose crossed with a chisel, the sign of a working mason claiming what his own hands had built. Beneath it, cut with less flourish but no less care, 3 initials. She did not move for a long moment. The desert outside made its small night sounds, wind finding the gaps in stone that had stood empty far longer than she had been alive, and she stood in the vault's dry cold, with her fingers resting on letters cut a century before her birth. She had seen those initials before. Not carved into rock, but inked, faded to the color of weak tea, on the corner of a folded parchment her father kept in the tin box beneath his surveying instruments. A paper he had shown her only once, when she was perhaps 12, calling it family business and saying no more, the way he said no more about most things that mattered. She had thought at the time it was a name from a debt or a deed, some dry legal matter belonging to men long dead and forgotten. She understood now that it was neither. She brought the lantern closer, until the light lay directly across the stone, until there could be no mistaking what her hand had found, and she stood there a long while, simply looking at it, the way a person looks at a face they had not expected to see again. She sat down on the stone floor of the vault, the lantern between her knees, and drew out the tin box she had carried across 300 miles of desert, without once opening it since her father's death. Her hands were steadier than she expected. She had learned that steadiness from him, the way he could unfold a survey map in a windstorm and still read every line without flinching, and she used it now, working through the papers by lantern light the way he had taught her to work through anything that mattered, slowly, in order, checking each fact against the next before permitting herself to believe it. The parchment was where it had always been, pressed flat beneath his old transit compass, the ink gone the color of weak tea, just as she remembered. She held it beside the carved letters and saw what she had already known before she saw it, the same hand, or near enough, the same particular slant to the second letter, a flourish at the base of the third that no careless mason would trouble himself to make. Beneath the initials on the parchment, in her father's own small, patient script, someone had once written a single line identifying the man as a stonemason attached to a mission some 60 miles north, dead some 140 years, his labor unpaid and unrecorded except in the buildings he left standing. She had brought, besides her father's papers, a slim volume of mission records copied by a territorial clerk years before, the kind of dry official document her father had collected the way other men collected rifles or watches. She found the page by memory, her finger tracing down a column of names until it stopped on the one she was looking for, and there it was again, plain as a signature on a bank draft, the same name, the same trade, listed among the mission's builders in the year the cistern would have been dug. She understood, sitting there in the cold and the dark with the lantern burning low, that the ruins above her had never been a failed settlement at all. No one had ever tried and failed to build a town here. Someone had succeeded, deliberately, at building something else entirely, a place meant to hold water and silver and secrets through a season of violence, engineered by a man who had known exactly what he was doing, and who happened, by some plain accident of blood she had not asked for and could not now refuse, to be her own. She rode into the territorial seat 11 days later, the papers wrapped in oilcloth against her chest like something that might still be stolen from her, though there was no one left to steal it. The land office was a narrow room with a plank counter and a clerk who had the look of a man who had recorded 10,000 claims and expected nothing from the 10,001st. She placed the mission records before him, and her father's survey notes, and the rubbing she had made of the carved name in the vault stone, and she did not explain any of it beyond what the documents already said. He read for a long while. He asked her name twice, as though the second time he expected a different answer. She gave him the same one both times, and watched him write it into the ledger in a hand far less careful than her father's had ever been. The claim was recorded under her own name that afternoon, the basin and the ruins and the water rights that came with them, and she rode back out with a receipt folded into the same oilcloth that had carried it in, and she did not feel triumphant so much as settled, the way a plumb line settles once it has finally stopped swinging. She built slowly, the way her father had taught her to survey. One true point established before the next was measured from it. A single room first, set against the old vault wall for the coolness it gave off in summer. A well reopened where the cistern had once fed a channel long since silted shut. Cattle came later, and then a second room, and then years she would afterward find difficult to separate one from another, the way distant hills lose their edges in heat shimmer and become simply the shape of the horizon. She kept her father's satchel on a shelf by the door, long after its leather had cracked past use, and she kept the mission ledger copy beside it, and visitors who asked about the ruins were told, plainly, that they had been built by a mason 2 centuries dead, and that the mason's name was her own, worn down through generations, the way water wears a channel through stone, slowly, and without asking anyone's permission to keep flowing. The old woman on the porch let the evening settle over her the way it settled over the basin every night at this hour, the light going long and copper across the stone, the swallows cutting low over the reopened well. She had told the story many times by now, to grandchildren mostly, though tonight it was only the compass she held, turning it once in her palm before setting it down on the porch rail beside her, its brass gone soft and dark with handling, its needle still true. She did not raise her voice when she spoke of her uncle. She never had. That had been his particular gift to her, in the end. The coldness of the account book, the $4 counted out without apology, the closing of a ledger he believed settled a matter finished. He had wanted, she supposed, a clean page. Bankers generally did. A name struck through, an obligation discharged, nothing left owing to anyone. He got his clean ledger, she said, and did not smile exactly, though something in her face eased the way stone eases under long weather. He closed his account and thought that was the end of it. What he did not know, what he never troubled himself to learn, was that he had also closed the door on 140 years of family standing in this basin, and that in doing so, he had handed her the key to it, without ever meaning to. $4, she said again, quieter now, as though testing the smallness of the sum against everything that had come after. The vault, the inscription, the name cut into stone by a hand 2 centuries gone, that turned out, after all, to be her own name, worn down and passed forward the way a channel is worn by water that never once asks the rock's leave. She looked out at the ruins in the last of the light. The walls she had raised joined seamlessly now to the walls a builder mason had raised long before any territory had a name for itself. The 2 kinds of stone indistinguishable at this distance, in this light. The cistern still held water, the well still gave it up sweet. Somewhere past the ridge a wagon creaked along a road her father had once surveyed with a chain and a transit, and a patience he had passed to her entire, the only inheritance that had ever mattered. She did not need to say the rest. The land said it for her, settling into dusk the way it had every evening for 140 years, and would go on doing, she suspected, long after she herself had gone quiet in it.